Okay, let's get into this. The Maniac Latin Disciples, you hear that name, and you probably picture something pretty intense, right?
Definitely. It sounds like a group with a long, maybe dark history.
But the truth, it actually started with, well, a baseball club. In Humboldt Park, Chicago, we're talking mid-1960s.
Yeah, kind of an all-American beginning almost. It's
But not
quite the contrast to where things ended up.
exactly. And that journey, that transformation, that's what this deep dive is all about. We're digging into the Maniac Latin Disciples.
We've pulled together quite a bit of historical documentation to trace their path.
Right. Starting in Humboldt Park in the mid-60s, we want to map out the key moments, the big shifts that defined them.
Trying to understand, how do they get from point A, the baseball team, to point B, being this major player in Chicago's gang scene?
What drove them initially? Who did they align with? Who were their enemies? And how did they expand like they did?
It's really a case study, isn't it? How groups form and adapt in cities, driven by community stuff, conflict, the need for power,
Yeah.
all of it.
So let's start right at the beginning, the genesis. Mid-60s, Humboldt Park. You've got these Puerto Rican teenagers.
And their main thing at first was just playing baseball.
Yeah.
Nothing more, really. Seems simple enough.
Yeah, seems innocent. But the context, the environment, that was key.
Absolutely. These kids were apparently getting harassed, even attacked, by other gangs already established there. The Simon City Royals, the Gaylords, Harrison Gents.
So this pressure from outside really forced their hand. It changed everything.
It became the catalyst, yeah. This baseball club suddenly needed to protect itself.
And by defending themselves, they started gaining, well, respect on the street, you could say.
And interestingly, that act of self-defense also caught the attention and even support of another group that was coming up to Lich Deer.
It really shows how these things often start, doesn't it? A need for protection, banding together against threats.
And that early nod from the Black Disciples sort of hints at the complex web of alliances that would shape Chicago gang history later on.
So this need for safety, these new connections, it led to the next step. The baseball club merged with another local group, the Latin Scorpions.
That happened in 1966, and that's the official birth of the Latin Disciples.
And leading this new young gang based around Hirsch and Rockwell, a guy named Albert Hitler Hernandez, their first king.
That name, Hitler. It's jarring, but maybe it tells you something about the image they wanted to project. Strength, maybe fear.
Definitely signals a shift away from just playing ball towards something more confrontational.
So they're formed. What happens next? How do they start fitting into the bigger picture?
Well, they established this early link with the Black Gangster Disciples, the group that, later split into the Black Disciples and Gangster Disciples.
And sources say this wasn't just a casual thing. It was described as a business relationship, both on the streets and inside prisons.
What does that usually mean, a business relationship back then?
Could be a lot of things. Sharing territory, maybe pooling resources for certain activities, definitely building a support network, especially inside the prison system where these affiliations are crucial.
So laying the groundwork for bigger things.
Yeah, which leads us to 1978, a really pivotal year. They decide to join the Folks Alliance.
Okay, for anyone listening, the Folks Alliance, that was a huge coalition of Chicago gangs. What did joining mean for the Latin Disciples?
It was massive. Instantly, it defined who their enemies were. Any gang under the rival People Nation banner.
So groups like the Latin Kings, Vice Lords, Black Peace Stones.
Precisely. Groups they probably already had beef with, but now it was official alliance-wide hostility.
And it also solidified that they're allies,
Yeah.
right? Because of something called the United Latino Organization.
Yes, that ULO connection meant that joining Folks automatically put them alongside the Spanish Cobras, Imperial Gangsters, and Latin Eagles. It basically redrew the map of gang affiliations across Chicago.
These alliances really changed the game. But let's talk conflict. A major event was the death of their first leader, Albert King Hitler Hernandez, in 1972.
Right. And the way it happened is pretty significant. Reports say he was killed by Latin kings.
Why? What kicked it off?
Apparently, he told some Latin kings to take off their gang colors because they were in what the disciples considered their area, a dispute over territory and respect.
And that escalated to murder, just like that.
Yeah. And that incident sparked an all-out war between the Latin disciples and the Latin kings. It shows how fast things could ignite over perceived slights.
Absolutely. And after this, you see their focus shift again. They set up a big drug spot at Rockwell and Potomac.
The Twilight Zone
Mm-hmm.
became notorious. That's when they really got deep into the heroin trade.
And that fueled their power, right? On the northwest side, we see factions popping up in different parts of Humboldt Park, places called Murder Town, Wild Side.
Grim nicknames. But yeah, getting into the drug trade often centralizes a gang's activity. It brings in money, allows more control over turf. It's a move towards a more organized criminal operation.
And they weren't content just staying in Humboldt Park. 1976, they push into West Humboldt Park. 77, they move into Logan Square.
Predictably, this expansion didn't go unnoticed. It led to more fighting.
With who? The gang's already there.
Exactly. Latin Kings again, and another group called the Insane Unknown Kings. They saw the disciples moving in as a direct challenge.
Because territory is everything. It means access to drug markets, influence.
Right, so trying to expand into someone else's turf, that almost always means violence. Defending what's yours or taking what you want.
And it had real costs. In 1978, the leader of their Logan Square faction, a guy known as Chi D, was murdered.
By the insane unknowns, yeah. Losing a leader like that, especially violently, is a huge blow. It shakes things up.
Creates instability, maybe fuels revenge.
Definitely. It often starts a cycle. The group wants payback, needs to show strength, maybe warn off others.
And that seems to be what happened. There was a big police drug bust in 79 that hit the leadership.
And after that, a new figure emerges. Fernando Fernández Zayas. He becomes the new prince.
And here's the wild part. He gets locked up in 83 for ordering hits on insane unknowns, including one supposedly involved in Chi-Chi's murder.
But he keeps running the gang from prison for over a decade.
That's pretty incredible. What does that tell you about how these groups operate?
It shows their resilience.
Yeah.
Leadership isn't always about being physically present on the street. The structures, the loyalty, the communication, it can allow control even from behind bars.
Then also in 1983, they changed their name. Latin Disciples becomes the Maniac Latin Disciples.
Right, the MLD.
Do we know why they added Maniac? What was the thinking there?
The sources don't spell out the exact reason, but the usual interpretation is it was about projecting a more intense image, more aggressive, maybe unpredictable, fearless, that kind of thing. A branding exercise almost.
Makes sense. The 80s also saw them push into the Hermosa neighborhood. Areas got names like Omskyville, Killa City.
More expansion. And then there's that story about Albert Chino D. Ojeda.
Ah, yeah, Chino D. He wanted to be a major drug player within the MLD.
Yeah, big ambitions.
Yeah.
But it caused conflict inside the gang. He ended up getting shot by rivals within the MLD, leaving him paralyzed.
Wow. Internal fighting? But he kept going, ran his drug operation from a wheelchair?
Reportedly, yes. It really shows the intensity of the internal competition, especially over drug money, and maybe the level of commitment to that life, even after something so devastating.
So we mentioned the Folks Alliance earlier. MLD, Spanish Cobras, they were allies for a long time.
Right.
But that started to fall apart in the 90s.
Yeah, things got messy within the Folks Alliance. Competition started overriding the old loyalties.
What specifically happened between the MLD and the Spanish Cobras?
Well, in 1992, there was a major blow-up. It started over bad drugs, apparently. A Cobra dealer ended up getting murdered by MLDs.
And the Cobras retaliated.
Oh, yeah. Led to a 2-day shooting war in Logan Square. Shows how quickly drug disputes could shatter even long-standing alliances.
And the tension just kept building after that.
Seems like it. Around 1994, friction with the insane Spanish Cobras really ramped up. This was after nearly 20 years as allies. It was mainly about drug turf again.
There was that high-low incident mentioned.
Right. A maniac got shot by a Cobra. MLDs planned a big retaliation, led by Johnny Loco Almodovar.
But it got stopped.
Yeah, because someone inside the MLD snitched, tipped off the police.
A snitch within their own ranks. That signals serious problems, doesn't it? Trust breaking down.
Absolutely. Erosion of trust, internal divisions, maybe shifting loyalties. It suggests things were getting really unstable inside the MLD itself.
And it wasn't just conflict with other gangs. They had a brutal civil war within the MLD.
That's right. The Bums faction, the original group from around Rockwell and Potomac, tried to take over drug spots from other MLD factions.
Like the one at Tallman and Wabansia.
Exactly. It was a straight-up internal power grab. Vicious fighting between different MLD sets.
And it even led to the murder of their own leader, Enrique Prince Rick Dog Garcia. I think that was featured on that show, Gangland.
It was. His murder by other renegade MLD members really highlighted how deep the internal splits went. It's a stark reminder, these gangs aren't monolithic. Disputes over money, power, leadership can tear them apart from the inside.
So this civil war, which finally burned out around 1998, it must have really hurt them.
The sources say the damage was severe, weakened their overall power, disrupted everything, made them more vulnerable.
And then came the early 2000s. More problems.
Yeah, major police raids targeting the leadership took out a lot of key figures, decimated the top ranks, really.
So where does that leave the Maniac Latin Disciples today, based on what we know?
There's still a significant presence on Chicago's northwest side, but their power, their overall influence, it's diminished compared to their peak. The internal war and the police crackdown took a heavy toll.
But they didn't just stay in Chicago, did they? They spread out. Wisconsin, Tennessee, Michigan, Ohio, Texas.
Yeah, Antioch, Nashville, Memphis, Milwaukee, Dallas, Houston. They popped up in various places.
How does that even happen? A Chicago street gang setting up shop in Nashville?
It can happen in a few ways. Members move away, maybe for family reasons or to escape heat and start new chapters there. Or sometimes people in other cities just adopt the name and symbols. And the prison system is huge for spreading affiliations, too.
Right, you mentioned prison. There's this connection to the Spanish gangster disciples, but that's a prison thing.
Yes, the Spanish Gangster Disciples, or SGD, is primarily a prison-based unity under the Folks umbrella. It's distinct from the street gang SGDN, the Spanish Gangster Disciple Nation.
And the founders of that street gang, SGDN, were actually former MLDs.
That's the connection, yeah.
Yeah.
It gets complicated, showing how affiliations shift and splinter between the street and prison environments.
Okay, before we wrap up, let's quickly cover the identifiers. How would you recognize MLD members or their turf colors?
Symbols. Their main colors are black and light blue.
Black and light blue. Got it. Symbols.
Several key ones. A heart, but with devil horns and a tail. There's a hooded figure called the monk. They've also used the swastika and the trident, which is common for Folks Nation gangs.
Anything else?
Yeah, they use a distinctive black-lettered D logo. It looks quite similar to the Old English D used by the Detroit Tigers baseball team.
Interesting. So, colors, symbols, that specific D, visual markers of identity.
Exactly. Ways to show affiliation and claim territory.
Okay, so pulling this all together, it's quite a trajectory. From a Humboldt Park baseball team just trying to avoid getting beat up,
To becoming a major player in Chicago's gang world, deeply involved in the drug trade, forging alliances, fighting brutal wars.
marked by that devastating internal civil war, shifting loyalties within the Folks Alliance.
And eventually spreading, maybe surprisingly, far beyond Chicago, even as their power in their home city seemed to wane a bit.
The really standout parts for me are that unexpected origin, the sheer destructiveness of the internal conflict, and that geographic spread.
Definitely highlights the complex life cycle these groups can have.
So here's a final thought for you listening. When you think about these patterns, the external threats leading to formation, the internal power fights, the lure of drug money, the way alliances form and breaking, how much of this is unique to street gangs?
Or could we see echoes of these dynamics, the struggle for power, territory, identity, the response to threats in other kinds of groups, or even larger societal structures? What does the MLD story really tell us about how human groups compete, adapt, and define themselves?